Just gonna give it one more minute as people are filtering in, but it is 6:30, so we're gonna go ahead and get things started. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy you could join us today, and my name is Alex Jorgensen, and I'm a board member of Alaska Common Ground. I want to welcome everyone to tonight's event, Just What is the Permanent Fund and Who is in Charge? We're happy to have folks from around the state join us for this really important and critical discussion. Tonight's event is hosted by Alaska Common Ground, whose mission is to promote an engaged Alaskan democracy. Founded by Alaskans passionate about fostering civil dialogue around public policy issues, we have hosted presentations and discussions just like tonight's for over 3 decades. We aim to build a collective understanding of important issues that impact our great state. You can find more information about all of our previous events, including several others on fiscal policy issues, at akcommonground.org. Alaska Common Ground could not conduct the work we do without the support of our members and our donors. If you would like to support free events like this, please consider becoming a member or making a donation online at akcommonground.org. There should be a link in the chat, and we'd love to have you join us as a member and as a donor. Tonight's event is a Zoom panel discussion. Our moderator will start us off with some history and context about the Permanent Fund and its governance structure. After opening statements from our panelists, they will discuss what they see as governance issues and opportunities for improvement, with time for your questions at the end. So please, folks, if you have questions that come up during the presentation, please make sure you put them in the Q&A feature of the Zoom, not in the chat. We're not going to be pulling questions from the chat, so please use the Q&A. This event is going to be recorded, and it will be available at Alaska Common Ground's website at, again, akcommonground.org. And anyone who's signed up for tonight's event will get a email after the recording is done with a copy of the recording. And without further ado, I want to move in to introduce our moderators and panelists for tonight's event. Our moderator tonight is the esteemed Cliff Grow. Cliff is a lifelong Alaskan and lawyer who has studied the Permanent Fund as legislative staff member, a special assistant to the Alaska Commissioner of Revenue, an author, and Alaska State Representative. He has served on the board of Alaska Common Ground for more than 25 years. Moving on to our first panelist, Dermot Cole, a longtime Alaska newspaper reporter, columnist, and editor, has been writing about the Permanent Fund since 1977. He lives in Fairbanks and writes the reporting for the Alaska blog at www.dermotcole.com. Our next panelist is Craig Richards, a lifelong Alaskan. Craig was raised in Fairbanks. In addition to a finance degree from the University of Virginia, Craig holds a law degree from Washington and Lee University and an MBA from Duke University. As a young man, he clerked for an Alaska Superior Court justice and interned with investment managers for the Alaska Permanent Fund on 3 different occasions. Craig has worked on innumerable deals and financing for corporate and governmental clients. He focuses on complex oil and gas matters, including tax disputes, litigation, leasing, and utilization. He is a goal-oriented attorney who believes quality representation starts with integrity. Craig is a strongly committed public servant. He has served as Alaska's Attorney General under Governor Walker, as the Statehood Defense Coordinator under Governor Dunleavy, and, most importantly, as a 10-year trustee of the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation under both administrations, and included a stint as chair of the board. And finally, our final panelist is Rick Hafford, a 60-year resident of the state, 24 years in the legislature. When he retired, he was the Senate president and served as majority leader of the House when the Permanent Fund Dividend law was passed. So thank you so much to our esteemed panelists. And Cliff, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this, and I'm glad everybody can come out. We're going to talk about the Permanent Fund and how it is run tonight. So I want to start out by talking about what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about the Permanent Fund is big and important. We're going to talk about the long-term decline in the state of Alaska's revenues from oil development, how that has made the Permanent Fund even more important than it was before. And I want to say the focus tonight is on how the Permanent Fund is run. A fancy term for that is the governance of the Permanent Fund. We're not going to talk so much tonight about two other important topics that are frequently discussed, choices about the uses of the earnings of the permanent fund, or the investment strategies the permanent fund uses. Particularly on that latter point, I hope I don't disappoint people too much. But if there's anybody who came tonight onto the Zoom call and thought, I will get very specific advice tonight on when to move my money out of Indonesian stocks, and how to do the precise right allocation between Peruvian bonds and Turkish real estate, maybe you might want to move on because we will not have a focus on that. But we're also going to talk about why Alaska has a permanent fund and what kind of thing the permanent fund is and how the permanent fund has been run so far. And then we're going to talk, and this is going to be the balance in the major part of tonight's discussion. I'll talk about how we could change the way the permanent fund is run and what are the pros and cons of various proposed changes. Okay, let's start out with a very important big fact. The permanent fund is giant. The total permanent fund value as of February 28th this year, just last month, close to $89 billion. And that includes both the total value would include both the permanent fund's principal and its earnings reserve account. So this number is very big, but I think a way of understanding just how big it is that that number is bigger than the entire Alaska economy. The entire Alaska economy is smaller than the permanent fund. And there's an estimate of 74 billion, of one commonly used way of measuring the size of an economy that the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis put out last year. The permanent fund is big, but it's even more important than it used to be. It's always been important, but now its importance has only increased. And to understand that, you need to know that there's been a long-term decline in oil production in Alaska. And that long-term decline in oil production in Alaska has contributed to a humongous drop in the state of Alaska's oil revenues. Obviously, there's been a recent spike with the war over the last 4 to 5 weeks. But we've lost more than three-quarters of Alaska's oil production, which used to be more than 2 million barrels a day in the late 1980s, and has now been running well under 500,000 barrels a day. That has contributed, like I said, to a very large decline in the state of Alaska's oil revenues. So the state of Alaska changed its laws in 2018. And since that change in the law, the state of Alaska now relies heavily on earnings from the permanent fund to pay for general government. And that would mean commonly known things like schools, roads, troopers, et cetera, as well as for permanent fund dividends. So like I said, the permanent fund is big and important, but it is even bigger and more important than it used to be, and its importance will only grow going forward.
Hey,
So,
Cliff, I think you
yes,
have lost view of your slides. I didn't know.
okay. You lost view, or do you have them now? I did not hit slideshow. That might be the underlying problem. And I apologize for that. So let's go with sharing the slides. I got so excited after hearing your introductions, Mr. Jorgensen, that I managed to miss that. So here we go. Share. Do they show
There
up
we
now?
go.
All right. And I
Yes, if you just
apologize
hit go
for
through,
now. And now I'm going to hit one other thing. Do I hit custom slideshow? How do I get rid of the
hit
bars on the
start
left?
from beginning, Cliff, and then you can go to the slide you were talking about.
Okay, I hit start from beginning, and then I
And then
go
you can
like
just click
this.
through. Yeah, perfect. Just want to make sure that people see your beautiful slides.
I appreciate that. So there we go. The slide, like I said, the $88 billion that we have now on the permanent fund is, like I said, bigger than the 74 billion in the Alaska economy. And then, okay, now let's talk about where the money comes from uh, in the budget. And I managed to go through it. And you'll see that almost two out of every $3 now comes from permanent fund earnings. This is the current fiscal year, the budget year we're in now. And so almost two out of every $3 comes from the permanent fund earnings. And the technical term for this is the percent of market value draw, or POMV draw for short. And that, as I said, comes from that law that was passed in 2018. So oil, and you might have heard over and over again, hey, we're a oil state, oil and gas state. Alaska is, petroleum, stuck on petroleum. Well, that is not as true with the revenues now. Now, in terms of the revenues for the budget, the revenues are just a little bit under a quarter comes from oil and gas revenue. That's when the budget was built for this current year back last spring. And then everything else, and when I say everything else, I mean everything from alcohol taxes to tobacco taxes to marijuana taxes, to tax on insurance premiums. That raises just a little bit, above 10%, a little bit more than a dime on the dollar. And like I said, permanent fund earnings are where the action is mostly in the budget now. So the and let's talk now about why there's a permanent fund. And so now I got to take you back. Got to take you back to the 1970s, um, right after the Prudhoe Bay oil field was discovered on the North Slope in 1968, and when the pipeline was being discussed being built, and then when it was actually being built in the 70s from 1974 to 1977. And that was the beginning of the big oil era in Alaska. And the big oil era brought a desire in Alaska to save a portion of the oil wealth, because it was widely known there'd be a lot of oil wealth created, and not as much as eventually got created. But we knew there would be a giant slug of money coming into Alaska from the result of the oil development. So there became twin desires, both to spend most of that oil wealth, but also to save at least a portion of it. And so there were a couple of attempts to create a permanent fund. There was first an attempt that failed to create a permanent fund by statute, which is the laws the legislature passes every year and can amend every year. And then after that failed, there was a push to establish the permanent fund in the Alaska Constitution, which would be not something the legislature could change every year. But in 1976, the legislature put the constitutional amendment to create the permanent fund on the ballot, and the people of Alaska adopted that constitutional amendment, creating a permanent fund by a vote of almost 2-1. So it's worth it to look at what what it says. What the text of the amendment. And so there it is. It got passed in 1976. Has not been amended since then. And I want to highlight a couple things. One is at least 25% of all the royalties and a few other associated areas, of which the royalties are where the most dollars are put in a permanent fund. And then there's two things created. There's a principal to permanent fund, which is only used for income producing investments. And then there's the income from the permanent fund. And then that is all income from the permanent fund should be deposited in the general fund unless otherwise provided by law. So that's the text of the Constitutional Amendment that created the permanent fund back just about 50 years ago, 50 years ago this year. So I'm often asked, Cliff, why do we have a permanent fund? Why did the voters vote yes? Why did the legislature put in the ballot? Why did the voters approve the Constitutional Amendment? And the best answer came from Elmer Rasmussen, a longtime and very successful Alaska banker, who was the first chair of the Permanent Fund Board of Trustees. And he said the Permanent Fund began chiefly with a negative goal, just to save some money, put part of the one-time oil wealth beyond the reach of day-to-day spending. And that's the single best answer for why we have the Permanent Fund. So just because we created the permanent fund by constitutional amendment, it did not say exactly how it would work. And there was the passage of the adoption of the permanent fund constitutional amendment in 1976 triggered a 4-year fight in the Alaska legislature between those who wanted the permanent fund to be a savings and investment device and fund, and those people were in the Alaska State House, and those who wanted the permanent fund to instead be an economic development banker loan program, and most of those people were in the Alaska State Senate. And after a very tough 4-year fight that went to two free conference committees in 1980, football season just ended. If this is sort of like if the Super Bowl had gone to two overtimes, and it was a giant battle, and the House finally prevailed, and their view of what should occur won out, and that resulted in the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation and the setup we have today. So that legislation got signed on April 8th, 1980. The only person sitting in this photograph is Governor Jay Hammond, and there's some other people in that photo who helped create the permanent fund, and some others who were not shown in that photo. But that shows a number of things, including how popular giant glasses were back then. So that legislation passed in 1980 set out some goals. And it's worth going over what the goals the legislature announced in 1980 for what the permanent fund should be. The permanent fund should provide a means of conserving a portion of the state's revenue from mineral resources to benefit all generations of Alaskans. The permanent fund's goal should be to maintain safety of principal while maximizing total return. And then the permanent fund should be used as a savings device managed to allow the maximum use of disposal income from the permanent fund for purposes designated by law. Now, there's the chairman of that second free conference committee that produced the final legislation were two powerful legislators who produced a letter of intent that got published in the journals of the Alaska House and Alaska Senate. And it's worth quoting a portion of what they had to help us understand what the perm fund was supposed to be, how it was supposed to be run. And so, as you can see from the slide, the legislature expected that the new system to run the permanent fund, quote, would be protected from political influences, but at the same time responsive to changes in state policy and accountable to the people through the elected officials. In short, the aim was insulation without isolation. So let's talk about the details of how the permanent fund is run. The details are that the permanent fund, and this is the current law, it's changed somewhat over time. The constitutional amendment is itself not changed over time, but there have been some amendments in the decades since 1980. But currently, the permanent fund is run by a board of trustees with 6 members, all appointed by the governor, with no legislative confirmation. 2 of those 6 trustees must be heads of principal departments of state government, one of which must be the Commissioner of Revenue. Currently, the other head of the principal department of the state government, who sits as a cabinet, so-called cabinet member of the permanent fund trustees, is the Commissioner of Transportation and Public Facilities. The 4 trustees were members from the public, aside from the 2 that are in the governor's cabinet. Those 4 trustees are members from the public, must have recognized competence and wide experience in finance, investments, or other business management related fields. So the board annually elects the chair from its members. The board selects an executive director / CEO. The executive director CEO selects the staff who buy and sell the assets. And the board sets out broad targets for certain investment classes, but it does not set out or direct the purchase or sale of individual assets typically. The permanent fund's investments had changed a lot. The first deposit was in 1977, and it was $734,000 the year after the permanent fund got created. And you can see that, that now, just going by a recent, this year, where the permanent fund is, it's now, although originally the permanent fund was started out as all bonds, and then in the first years it was heavily bonds, but now the single biggest category is stocks, publicly traded stocks, and then there are bonds, and there's private equity, which is more like investments that are made by wealthy individuals and wealthy institutions. There's real estate around the world, private income and infrastructure is another category, absolute return. Tactical opportunities are like a category for the chief investment officer of the permanent fund to seize some particularly attractive investment to jump on right away. And then there's obviously a category for cash. Um, the permanent fund has grown in several ways. And the most famous way is, of course, the mandatory contributions under that constitutional amendment adopted in 1976. But it has also grown substantially through increases in values in the market, in markets, in special legislative appropriations. In some years that we might call fat years, the permanent fund, the Alaska legislature has appropriated, just directed money into the permanent fund principal. And so the permanent fund's grown that way. And then also there's been inflation proofing. The legislature has appropriated or put money into the permanent fund to guard against and compensate for the effects of inflation. Unfortunately, or just a fact, in a number of years, that's not always happened. The inflation proofing has not always occurred as would be called for in the projections. So let's talk about some possible goals in changing the governance. One goal you might have is that you might want to say, well, we want to, given how important the permanent fund is, we want to go even further to minimize risks of corruption, cronyism, and imprudence, and try to create additional protections against that by changing the way the permanent fund is run. You could and then another goal you could have would be to reduce the power of a very powerful person. The governor of Alaska was such a critical institution. It's important to note that the governor of Alaska is one of the most important, most powerful governors of any state. Sometimes said just constitutionally, Alaska's governor is the most powerful governor of any state. Sometimes said one of the two most powerful governors, just in terms of the powers already generated by the Constitution and established in the Constitution. So, like I said, one goal would be to perhaps reduce the power of just one powerful person, the governor, over the permanent fund. Now, there's been events over the last 6 years or so that have drawn some attention and been milestones and calls for change. One is the firing of a chief executive officer of the permanent fund, Angela Rodell, by the Board of Trustees in 2021. That led to examination and a long report by a private law firm about why that occurred. There was also the resignation of trustee Ellie Rubenstein in 2024 after some email messages leaked about the permanent fund staff's concern about her recommendations of particular investment advisors to the investment staff and concerns about potential conflict of interest. And then also most recently, a decision that did not have anything directly with the permanent fund, but also with another state fund, a different state fund, the Constitutional Budget Reserve, which is a younger, smaller fund, far smaller and younger fund that has different purposes, but is also managed by the state for public benefit. And last year, the then commissioner of revenue, Adam Crum, made some investment with a private equity firm that drew a lot of attention, and also has generated a report and investigating why that occurred. And as I said, I've stressed that was not the permanent fund, but it was another state fund, and it led some people to ask questions about, the much larger fund, the permanent fund. Now, there's various ways you could change governance. And various topics have been discussed over time, include how you select the trustees. Now, as I said, it's done by the governor. You could talk about the qualifications or change the qualifications of the trustees and their duties or standards of conduct in carrying out those duties. You could change the length of the trustees' terms. Now, the public members are set up for 4-year terms. They can be reappointed. The members of the cabinet that sit, by virtue of their office on the permanent fund board, that their terms go with, their tenure as the commissioners. You could change the number of trustees. There are six. Some people said maybe we should have an odd number. Maybe we should have seven. Um, you could define right now the acceptable cause for removal of a trustee. There's a requirement of cause, but you've never defined that the law is not defined what acceptable cause would be to remove the trustee. And then also you could increase legislative oversight. Uh, I think looking back on the original management legislation adopted in 1980, there was a expectation perhaps of more legislative oversight than there has been. Additionally, you could also change the pay. Trustees get $400 a day for meetings. That number has not changed since 1980. It would be more than $1,500 a day now if you just adjust it for inflation. And I think the legislators who voted for it back in 1980 would be surprised that the pay is still the same now. Um, um, so there you go. That's my slideshow. And we're now going to move into a, uh, a discussion. And I'm going to ask all the panelists to unmute themselves, Dermot Cole, Rick Halford, Craig Richards, and so we can actually go into this discussion. And I want to start out our discussion by asking each of the trustees to talk about and take 2 or 3 minutes to talk about what they think are the best parts of permanent fund governance now, the best things about the way the permanent fund is run now, and what they might think are parts of the way the permanent fund is run now that it should be changed. And I'm going to start out with the person who has watched this the longest of any of the people involved, or close to the longest, maybe a tie between Rick Halford and Dermot Cole, but certainly the first one who had a chance to vote on these matters of governance. Rick Halford, who got elected to the legislature in 1978 and was in the legislature when the management legislation passed back in 1980. Rick, what are the best and worst parts of permanent fund governance now? And what would you suggest we should change, if anything?
Well, it's been an amazing time. We're certainly blessed with the curse of unearned wealth, but you go back to the start, 69 lease sale. I think the state budget was something like $118 million, and we got 900 million. You come forward to today, and there's been 19 billion barrels of oil through the pipeline that was supposed to have. I remember the early numbers were 12 billion in the reserve and so on and so forth. But the present value of that would be something like $1.3 trillion. And I'm certainly glad that we saved a tenth of it in the permanent fund, but I am very concerned about where we're going at this point. You know, for 35 years and 8 different governors, the fund was protected by a formula that connected it to Alaskans. A decade ago, that connection was broken by a governor's veto. Uh, no connection kind of means no understanding at the public level now. The permanent fund dividend is a political football, and the fund itself seems to be declining. Uh, Transparency is somewhat in trouble, and there are real questions about how it works. Uh, I think the survival of the fund is in danger. Governance is critical to that. Elmer Rasmussen had a lot of very good ideas at the time we got started, and many of those weren't followed to the degree he wanted them followed. Uh, and it seemed that the connection to the people covered that for a long time, but that's not the case today. And I'm sadly of the opinion that if we continue with the course we're on without changes, and I think they start with governance, but they may be much bigger than I think, simple little tweaking of the system. But if we don't make some changes, we should recognize that the permanent fund is going to become the temporary fund. So,
Um, okay. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no, I'm very glad for what we did and what we saved, but it's a tiny portion of what we had. And we have been a generation that has paid for almost nothing and expected an awful lot from our state government. And I think that's something that we have to face and realize. But to be uh, trust fund kids uh, funded two-thirds to three-fourths by unearned income is not a healthy state system.
Um, Rick, I really appreciate it. I do want to make one clarification. When you talk about saving 1/10, that gets to an important point. The constitutional amendment calls for saving at least 25% of the royalties and a few other categories. But the oil revenues, the state makes money not only from the royalties, but also from taxes on the oil industry. And the constitutional amendment does not require, as a mandatory matter, that any of the money the state makes from oil taxes go into the permanent fund. So that's, I think, what you're getting at with the 1/10. Is that correct?
You're absolutely right. But I
Okay.
think the moral question is that we're dealing with something that's non-renewable resources, owned in common by the people of Alaska, and should be thought of as in common for all generations of Alaskans. This particular generation has been incredibly blessed, and we're proud of saving 1/10, but we didn't save enough.
Um, Craig, thank you, Rick. I want to go to you now, Craig. You have the distinction on this panel of actually having served on the Permanent Fund Board of Trustees, did it for about 10 years, including some multiple years as chair of the Board of Trustees, elected by your fellow trustees. So I'll ask you the same question I asked Rick. What are the best parts about Permanent Fund governance? What are the worst parts? And what recommendations for change in the way the Permanent Fund is run do you have, if any?
Sure. So first, I'd like to address Rick's point that, we saved, but we didn't save enough. I'll say that that's probably always true, but we saved more than anyone else in the history of the world in the same circumstance. At a $90 billion permanent fund, we have 12 to 14 times our budget. There's nobody that has that kind of coverage ratio on their sovereign assets relative to their total budget. So did we do it perfect? No. But when back in the 70s when they set it up, they did it pretty well on the saving side. Um, on the governance side, I think they also did a pretty good job. The 1980 Act that's been governing the permanent fund since practically it's been managing funds, I think is demonstrated to be pretty successful. Nothing's perfect, but it's been pretty good. I've spent almost 2 decades now involved in almost every level of state government, from the judiciary to having been, a cabinet level position to a board of trustees to having sued the state. I don't know. I can't even tell you how many times, a couple dozen probably on various things in one form or another. And I can say, based on my observations, that the Permanent Fund Corporation is the most highly functioning public agency or public corporation that I've ever been exposed to. And when I say it's high functioning, I mean it is operated by extremely competent people. There's a good and well-defined governance structure, and politics plays little to no role in either the way it's managed or the way it's governed. So before people jump into a round of let's change a bunch of things, I always want to come back to that old Mark Twain quote of those that advocate revolution have an obligation to replace what they tear down with something better. Um, and I think the permanent fund, although it's not perfect, I think it's pretty darn good. And so let me talk about when I think about governance, the two things that I think most about the permanent fund, the two driving principles in the way I look at it is we want to keep politics out of the fund, which means the legislature and the governor both. That's number one. That should be the number one goal. Keep the politics out of it. And the number two goal is, I think, keep the board of trustees out of investment decisions. Unlike a lot of other public funds and a lot of other large pools of money, the permanent fund board of trustees doesn't manage the individual assets. And I'll get to that in a minute. So right now we have, I will say, in the governor has a lot of power over the appointment of the board, and thus it has potentially a lot of power over the governance of the board in the sense that under our Constitution, the legislature doesn't get to confirm trustees of the permanent fund. That's just the way the Constitution's set up because it's not a principal department and it's not quasi-judicial or regulatory. So that means throughout the history, the governor is solely responsible for appointment. Um, And to me, that has probably on the whole been a good thing and not a bad thing. Because the consequence of doing alternatively is you end up with legislative politics into the fund. And one of the examples you had on your slide, Cliff, was Angela Rodell. Well, from my point of view, that was the worst thing that can happen, right? You had the legislature inject itself into a standard management process that resulted in disruption at the fund. So the other thing I would say is, so one, whatever process, if you're going to redesign it, whatever you do, balance those two things, right? Keep the politics out of the fund and then keep the board out of investment decisions. And that's why I know I'm running out of time here. That's why I want to address, in particular, the one thing that I think would be the most damaging thing that can be done to the fund, and that is to pay the trustees. Right now, the trustees are essentially statesmen, historically, is what they've been. They're people that volunteer their time. Elmer Rasmussen talked about back, in the early 80s that they should be paid more. But that was when the trustees were actively managing the money. Now the staff manages all the money. The board of the trustees come to the quarterly meetings. They do a little bit of oversight. And by and large, it is their role as state board statesmen that keeps them out of the day-to-day management of the fund. And I think the other example you used with Ellie, what caused that brouhaha was you had, I think for the first time in a long time, at least that I've been aware of the board, you had someone that was trying to get into the day-to-day management. And that's ultimately what led to sort of some of the blow-ups and problems we saw. So other than ending it with, I think governance is less of an issue than the need to have a constitutional amendment to combine the corpus and the earnings reserve so we don't all go broke. That's personally where I think the most important focus is. But everyone acknowledges that the permanent fund is not perfect. Oh, and I'll end it just with this. So you did say, what reform would I think makes sense? 6 trustees doesn't make any sense, right? I was on the board over 10 years, and I think we had one vote that was tied. So, that means one time you were kind of stuck in high centered. The second thing that I think doesn't make sense is a 4-year term. It takes a year as a trustee to even understand what's going on. It takes 2 years to really get it. So a 4-year term is just pretty short. The Federal Reserve is 14 years. I think that's probably a little aggressive, but 8 years, that probably could make sense. And as to number, I mean, it wouldn't hurt it if it got a little bigger, like to 9 or something. But there's also some value in a small board too, because it means people are very cooperative and you don't get factions, or well, you don't get them as easily as you do with more board members. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Dermot, you're also a very long time observer. Like you said, you first started writing about the Permanent Fund in 1977, the year after it was created. And so I'll ask you the same question that I asked Rick and Craig. What are the best parts about the Permanent Fund governance? What are the worst parts about how it's run? And what suggestions would you make, if any, to change how the Permanent Fund is run today?
Excuse me. Thank you, Cliff. Yeah. The best part about the Permanent Fund, it is probably the outstanding success story of Alaska state government in our history. And we should be proud of that. At the same time, we should be examining it to see how it can be improved. And I disagree with Craig on several points he just made. First of all, I don't believe it would be the worst thing possible to pay the trustees. I agree with Elmer Rasmussen that you get what you pay for. That was the line he used when he argued that the trustees should be paid as much as legislators. That was the proposal in 1980. I don't know what the exact pay is. But that is a key issue. But along with that, we need a transparent recruiting process for trustees, a transparent vetting process for trustees. And it makes no sense to have 2 members of the governor's cabinet who have full-time jobs serving as trustees. If the revenue commissioner is going to be on the permanent fund, then we better have a competent revenue commissioner. And this gets to the other serious problem we have. And this dwarfs anything with the permanent fund corporation. The abysmal job the legislature has done in oversight. The legislature abandoned legislative oversight almost at the beginning. There has been no real legislative oversight of the permanent fund for more than 40 years. So as we mark the 50th year of the permanent fund, I think that should be a priority. How can we bring back legislative oversight? And that would solve a lot of problems. It would allow for public education about what this fund is all about, how it operates, and who runs it. I think the trustees have a lot more work to do. And that's one reason why I think they should be paid. They should be the public representatives of this fund, explaining to the public, if it can be explained, why have we invested many billions of dollars in private equity? I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have, either pro or con on that, but no one has made the case. No one has made uh, as explained the challenges that we face in the future. I think the fund has tried to explain this two account system and why a change would be necessary, but with adequate legislative oversight, better public education, we'd be on much solider ground. And a lot of it begins with the legislature doing something. Now, I know that people in the legislature have thought about this issue in recent years. Some people have, not a majority of the legislature, but some people have. But they believe that whatever they would come up with would be vetoed by the governor, so they've really not done anything. We just and finally, about political influence. A governor with the current structure can have direct political influence, interference, really, over the course of the permanent fund, over its operations, because it depends on the quality of the commissioners he places on that board and the quality of the trustees he selects, or she. But right now, we have no idea of there's no public vetting of trustees. Again, but I'll stop here. That's kind of that covers a lot of what I wanted to say.
I want to go to Rick now again. Rick, in terms of governance, you've heard some specific proposals made by Dermot and Craig in terms of the length of the terms, the pay, the difference in increased legislative oversight, the identity of who should be on the board, whether the board should spend more time in educating the public, and also more directly trying to reduce the power of the governor in terms of how the permanent fund is run. What comments do you have? You're one of Alaska's most experienced legislators. I remember that I was like surprised, having seen it from the beginning, just how long your career ran. You might have the same reaction, Rick. But of all those suggestions, do any resonate with you? Do you have any more specific suggestions about how the permanent fund is run in terms of those kinds of particular issues or questions in terms of what you'd like to say right now?
Well, I think transparency is a real issue, and I think that affects private equity. It affects a lot of things. Dave Rose was pretty clear in his analysis that trust is really as important as anything else in the survival of the fund itself. And I think trust takes transparency, it takes explanation, it takes education. But I'm afraid that with the pressures we're under and the fact that we are really collectively very, very entitled as a population. We're willing to spend one-time capital wealth unearned to maintain a level of spending without any contribution from ourselves and without really facing a fair share of the resources themselves either. If we go back to the basic numbers, it is horrendous that the overwhelming majority of our budget is coming from totally unearned sources that are non-renewable, and that's a difficult place to be. I think some of the things that we could do, we need to wonder if they're just rearranging chairs on the deck of the Titanic. I'm afraid that, and some of the people that were still around, I had the incredible benefit of being uh, educated and taught some lessons I didn't want to learn at the time by a pretty tremendous group of people. And many of the people in the Constitutional Convention were still around. But a lot of them, the after the fact thoughts to me and some of them, if we had known just what was going to go on with the permanent fund, if we could look back, uh, there would have been a pretty good argument to make the permanent fund a totally separate branch of government, somehow a hybrid with appointments from the legislative branch, executive branch, court system. But what we've done is we've created a huge fund, and in part it's a little bit like Ada with some sideboards, but it really can be, the power to invest is very, very close to the power to spend. And the executive branch is not supposed to have the power to spend without appropriation. The legislature is supposed to appropriate, the executive is supposed to implement. But having the ability to unilaterally make investment decisions on at least 10 times the total state government every year, and having the only thing in the Constitution that has to be interest bearing, well, that can be 1/4%. That's not market rate. And the value of that exceeds the appropriation power of the legislative branch. I think our government is out of balance. And if we had a chance to look back and ask the people that set it up, I think at least the ones that I knew would probably agree. We have the most powerful governor in the country. It's not, outside of that, it was intended. We need an executive branch with authority, but total control over the investment of this huge amount of money is a tremendous piece of economic horsepower that really overwhelms the legislative branch's power of appropriation.
Okay.
Well, but and Cliff, and beyond that is effectively under the governor's control, because the governor appoints the trustees, and you have to rely on the quality of the trustees to maintain independence. And so there's such a structural failing in the system, and I don't agree that it's revolution to change that. And I also question the idea. I'm not a lawyer, all right, and I may be wrong, but the court decision that this all stems from, the idea that the legislature can't confirm members of state corporations. That court decision was about confirming deputy commissioners and division directors. It's not exactly the same thing as a corporation that's this size. I mean, I would argue that the legislature could simply redefine the permanent fund as a principal department. Now, that could create some problems because, again, it would be under the governor. But anyway, there's far too much power concentrated in one person right now. That's a real structural problem.
Well, how about this? How about this, Dermot? I mean, so I think I've looked at this both as Attorney General and Rick. I've actually gone back and read some of the stuff years ago that you did in 2000 to try to address this with a constitutional amendment. And the Constitution does seem pretty clear that unless you kind of do things that are a little out there, like redefine it as a principal department, that the governor has the appointment power. Why not just create a fiduciary statute or a fiduciary duty on the part of trustees that requires independence from the governor? I mean, again, I was on the board for 10 years and I know exactly how it operates and I know exactly how the last couple of governors, and I can tell you, they don't interfere. They're afraid to interfere, right? But is it a theoretical problem? Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
So
my point is that they could
yeah,
interfere, and
so why not?
perhaps a law would solve that. But
Yeah,
we should also look at what the law is on who becomes a trustee. The law is written so vaguely that the owner of a hot dog stand can qualify as a trustee.
yeah,
Business
that's fair.
business experience. I mean,
The,
it's
The problem you have on that one is that, Alaska does not have a pool of people that are going to be the kind of people that you want to manage $90 billion. So that means you're always going to be pulling from, you don't want to pull from out of state, at least that's my view. So you're going to be pulling from a group of people that are not going to be the people you would ever hire to manage the money. So I don't even think it's business acumen or whatever the statute says is important. I just think it's adults, frankly. Like, I don't know that you could put adult as a statutory requirement, but sophisticated people that do adult things. That would be what I think the requirement should be.
What
Because
about
you're never gonna get Eichmann to come in here and manage this thing or be a
what
trustee.
what about the criteria that the board itself adopted for their own advisors? Can they meet that criteria themselves?
Absolutely
Uh,
not. There's not there's not
well,
there's not 10 people in the state of Alaska that could meet the criteria of our advisors.
let's explain what that's about. There's the investment advisory group,
Yeah.
which consists of three people who are really top flight investment professionals from around the country. And I might point it out here that they are paid $1,000 a day for meetings, while trustees get $400 a day. But anyway, there is no there are not people in the state who have that level of experience generally. But the law firm that the governor hired to investigate things after the uh, controversy with Ellie Rubenstein came back and had a couple of suggestions. One of which was to appoint trustees from out of state. Now there are you know
Yeah. Who was the one out
that
of
can be
state
debated.
trustee? Who was the one out of state trustee we had? Ellie.
Yeah, well, I must remember there was a Alaska Gaslight Development Corporation. Maybe I had an out of state trustee. Anyway, here, how about this? That's the kind of topic that the legislature should decide, and that's not a bad debate for the legislature to have.
Yeah.
But you know the uh, the other recommendation, another recommendation I had was that ban trustees from making financial investment referrals. They said
Yeah.
you should now. A committee of the trustees has refused to go along with that, which I think is a mistake. I think the trustees should adopt that as a policy, so that they are not referring investment people to the fund. Ms. Rubenstein made dozens of investment referrals during her short tenure on the board, and that's just not what people should be doing.
So the way they set it up, and maybe there's been more in the last couple of months since I've been off, but the way they set it up after that, informally the rule was always if you got contacted on something like that, you let the CIO and ED know, but that didn't get followed. So they adopted a formal rule that says it basically you just send it to the executive director and you're out of it, which I don't know, it seems reasonable to me.
I think we just say, please call the APFC and don't call the corporation.
Right.
Don't. I'm not in position to make that recommendation.
Sure.
Okay,
Can I throw in one other thing?
sure.
Talking about legislative oversight, there's an existing law that requires the legislature to prepare an annual report on what the fund is doing and audit, and it
Yeah.
hasn't done that. It hasn't done that since the early 19. Well, actually, has really never done it. So and that has existed since the beginning. So.
Yeah, I think the legislature has plenty of authority under state law to do any kinds of reasonable oversight.
And I think I think they haven't done it because the dividend sucks all the air out of the room every time, and that with the state now relying on the permanent fund to pay a lot of its bills, we can't really afford to ignore this.
Okay.
And
I wanted to ask a couple of the additional. Well, actually, I want to do two things. I want to ask each of you to ask a question to another panelist in terms of specifically about the governance, and then we're going to go to audience questions. But I wanted to ask you to each direct a question to another panelist. Rick, would you ask a question to Dermot or Craig in terms of what we've discussed so far?
Well, I guess to either one of them, one of the things that scares me about where we are is the the same authority to appoint, of course, exists with Ada. And it looks like Ada is the tiny example of what the permanent fund could become. And what you do with $1 billion versus what you do with $80 billion is pretty horrendous in just the investment potential and its influence on the direction of the state. And I wonder if there's any. I know way back when Dave Rose ended up for a while running both of them and considered Ada as a protection of the permanent fund because it kept some of the demand away from the permanent fund for what other people wanted it to become.
Craig or Dermot, do you have thoughts on that? Rick's question.
Well, I think Craig should answer that as a former trustee. He should know.
Well, let me also
Okay.
say this: a former student of Dave Rose, his office was across from Eric Wolforce, the first job I had in Anchorage. So in 2002 and 3 and 4, I spent a lot of time in Dave's office, and he's the one that inculcated me into a lot of my views on permanent fund governance, including that the public corporations act as blockers for the permanent fund, that there's always going to be a political desire for people to use state funds to achieve things they want to achieve, and having the Aerospace Corp and the railroad and Ada and the Student Loan Corporation and the Housing Corporation. A lot of people thought when those set up, their goal was to let the permanent fund run politically free, and those guys, interfere. So in terms of governance, I mean, I don't know. I would say that what we should be trying to do is get Ada's level of governance up to the permanent funds, not the permanent funds level of governance down to Ada's, which I'm sure is a challenge, but that to me is a goal, to make all these corporations as good as you can.
I think what Rick was trying to get at was the risk that the permanent fund would become more like Ada, and that you'd have a giant fund, the permanent fund, run in a way that Rick is more concerned about.
Yeah.
Craig, can you address that?
So that only happens if investment decisions become political, right? That's the only way that happens. So that goes back to my 2 points earlier: is keep the politics out of the fund and keep the board out of investment decisions.
But the governor can be, just by the matter of efficiency, far more dangerous than the legislative system, just because the legislative system is so multi-headed and so cumbersome. But a governor's decision to make a 10 or $20 billion investment can be a huge thing in terms of leading the private sector to go a certain direction. And if that can be done and influenced, it's part of the reason that the separation of powers is really at stake with regard to. I don't think you can keep, and I agree with your goal to keep politics out of it, but it seems like politics won't be out of it. It is a public fund of the state of Alaska. It is in the executive branch, and it's not set up as a trust. It's not, it's the only limitations are the constitutional language itself. And the constitutional language itself says income producing. Doesn't say market rate, doesn't say anything about what it really means. And the difference in 8% interest and a 1/4% interest is a huge present value, and it continues indefinitely.
Okay. Craig, could you ask a question to either Rick or Dermot in terms of what we've discussed so far about how the permanent fund should be run?
Sure. I'll take online, and I'll try to very briefly a discussion that Dermot and I had by email, which is currently the permanent fund and Treasury and the ARM board. All of them invest in private market investments, which aren't transparent in the sense of you can go look and see what stocks a permanent fund owns. You can't go, and I don't want to call it the permanent fund. I want to call it all the state investment systems. But you can't go and do that with all the details on the private markets because there's a state law that allows those to be confidential investments. And in order to do the investments, practically, they do need to be pretty highly confidential. So Dermot and I talked about, what do you do about that? On the one hand, private equity has historically been the permanent fund's highest returning asset class, But on the other hand, we've seen where it creates some issues in the sense of people feel like the lack of transparency is un-Alaskan and creates the concern that, people are doing bad things. So what are your thoughts, Sherman? What do we do about it?
Okay, well, it is uh, I mean, I think that's really a ripe target for argument because uh, you not only have lack of transparency, you have real social questions involving private equity that have been raised. And I do think the permanent fund and the trustees need to acknowledge uh, whether or not investments are not just profitable, but socially, is it the right thing to do? And there's real serious questions raised about how private equity has performed in the United States and its impact on communities. And that's a topic that has been unexplored by in the public realm here, just unexamined. That's the kind of thing I think the legislature needs to have a say in and analysis. The
Yeah.
legislature needs, I believe, a standing committee on the permanent fund. Now, to understand where the fund is invested and to understand where it should be invested or where it should not be, where it should be not be doing business. We had this controversy, and I know you were a very strong proponent of the in-state investment plan of $200 million, but the that raised some of these issues because the identity of the companies that where the investments were made are deemed to be a secret by the permanent fund because of confidentiality of what it says confidentiality rules exist under state law. And I don't think we should just rely on the goodness of these companies that received permanent fund money to identify or to publicly state that they did receive money. But that's where we're at. The permanent fund, said they couldn't force these companies to release this information, but they had to agree to release it. And we don't even know how much money they got. There's all sorts of transparency problems there, and that's just with 200 million. We have many billions invested in private equity and in private markets that don't the public just doesn't know much about, and legislators are woefully uninformed. That's my take on this in this situation. So I don't have an answer for you. I don't have an answer for that. It's a problem we need to address. And with the permanent fund 50 again, we need to look at this. You know, look at something other than the dividend. I agree with Rick that the dividend is a key issue. It's not this issue though. This is kind of a separate part of this. We need to make sure that this fund structure is solid enough to continue. And I think the board should be far more than 6 people, and it should not be 2 commissioners. The commissioners on the board, that really bothers me. I think this thing was fine for a 1980 plan where the investments were extremely simple. They were all in bonds, and they required no work or no thought. But today, there's a lot of work and a lot of thought that's required, and we need to have adapt this structure to the modern world. That's enough of my
Dermot,
lecture, I think.
Dermot, we're going to go, actually, you get to ask a question, then we're going to go to audience questions. Dermot,
Yeah.
what question would you like to ask for either Craig or Rick?
Well,
or both?
how about this? Why don't we go to audience questions? Is that a good question?
All right, here we go. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a political question that one of the audience members asked, and it's a purely political matter. Does the state of Alaska need to solve and resolve the debate over the permanent fund dividend that is tied up the legislature in a number of years in a row since we went off the formula approximately about 10 years ago? do we need to solve the permanent fund dividend question before the legislature would have bandwidth to address these governance issues that we're discussing now? And I'll let anybody take their own shot at that. Any of you, the three of you, do you have any thoughts or suggestions?
Well, they do have to solve that question on the dividend, and that will only come about with leadership from the governor and maybe more intelligent campaigning by the candidates for governor and candidates for the legislature. So far, I think we're just having a repeat of 2018 and 2022. The level of discussion about the dividend is inadequate, let's say. That's an exaggeration. But the legislature can also take on the structure of the permanent fund and educating itself about it.
Okay.
I
All
think
right.
I think the
Rick.
problem is going to be that, at some point, the effort to do away with the separation between the earnings reserve and the principal is going to become it's going to come to the forefront, and there's going to have to be a constitutional amendment to make the system work. And when there has to be a constitutional amendment, then you have to deal with the public. You have to get the supermajority in both houses, and I don't think that's going to happen without looking at all the pieces. So I think we're paralyzed by our own diversity, and it's going to take uh, a real shortage of money. The permanent fund is going down a little bit now, and there's proposals to make it go down even more. And that's a very dangerous situation. And eventually, it will run into the Constitution in reduction of principle in a way that's unconstitutional.
Rick,
I
look,
point out, I
I
just want to point
yeah,
out two things quickly. Number one is there's a lot of excitement in Alaska about or at least among the legislators, it appears, about the additional revenues the state is getting because of the Iran war. I would note that that's, costing the permanent fund money. So that I think that is a useful thing to understand. And I want to quote, without revealing this person, one of Alaska's more sophisticated politicians told me recently, Cliff, you will never get a constitutional amendment approved by the public in Alaska anymore that relates in any way to the permanent fund unless it explicitly addresses permanent fund dividends. Dermot, I think you have some thoughts.
okay. I would just say I know that there's a lot of debate about the two account system and whether it should be one account. I really think the key decision there, the key thing to making the two account system continue to operate and survive is just to reduce the withdrawal rate. And that means taxes. And, the reluctance to admit we need taxes lies at the heart of many of our problems, including this one, and the reluctance to address oil taxes, oil tax credits, and the minimum tax, and I don't see how you get a supermajority of a constitutional amendment for anything
Okay.
related to the fund.
All right. I wanted to go to another question that directly about governance that comes from the audience, which is about, we've talked about how there's 4-year terms for the public members. Some people have suggested, and there's some staggering of terms, but of course the governor can replace the trustees and has repeatedly. I mean, this has been done by more than one governor. So some people have suggested that if you had longer terms or defined cause, that you might help reduce the situation of a new governor coming in and replacing all the public members, for a cause, and obviously already has the commissioners lined up because it's a new governor. Does anybody have any thoughts about that?
Well, I would
Well,
just
I
say,
think
go ahead. Go ahead.
okay, well, the law currently says you have to have cause and has to be written.
Right.
But
Doesn't
that
define
doesn't
cause.
explain that. And I think the terms are staggered. But when you have a two-term governor, as we did with Mr. Dunleavy, he has appointed everyone. But there's a weakness there. It's a weakness.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually more than that because it's staggered 4-year terms for 4 years. So by the time a single term governor is done, the board will have been, the trustees can be fully replaced. Now, historically, that doesn't happen, but it certainly could. I'm not aware of any trustees that were removed from the board of trustees for cause, but that could have occurred before I was sort of aware. But in terms of what makes it cause, um, I mean, it can't hurt. You got to want it both ways. One, you don't want a governor that comes in and removes people and calls it cause when it's really political. But two, you also want to make sure if you get a dingbat on there for somehow that the governor can pull them. So you just want to do both.
It, Wally Hickle fired the entire board when he was elected.
I
I
didn't
don't
know
know.
that.
I don't know if Tony Knowles did or not, but I think Knowles might have as well. But that was when the law was changed to require cause.
Ah,
Um,
gotcha.
and so
Which is still not defined. I want to point out, right? In
yeah,
terms
the
of,
cause
yeah.
the cause could be because you don't have the right shoes. I mean, I don't
Uh,
know what the
um, so another question that has come out that is not directly about governance, but we've already talked about it a little, is we talked about private equity as an investment and the importance of transparency and how that's more difficult or at least been more complicated, problematic with private equity. Um, what about the question a legislator asks in the Q&A, should the legislature prohibit the permanent fund from investing within the state? Obviously, that has occurred now, and I would like actually all three of you to address that if you could.
Well,
Craig.
going
I
back
think you
to
should
the
start. Oh no, go ahead. Go
Yeah.
ahead, Rick.
go ahead. Going back to the original debate, I mean, it's a lot of this stuff is the same things that we talked about then, and all the economic interest said avoid the things that will go down when the state has a problem. So don't invest in your own strengths. That's contrary to the argument of bring the money home, and those that argument is 40 years old. But I don't believe that there's a shortage of capital. I think that basically it's looking for a deal, and that's not the permanent fund shouldn't be making a deal for somebody. Uh, there's other places to go, and that's that's what Hammond called the unequal dividends that he discussed in the whole argument over the original dividend. When you are subsidizing loans that you have to have a fortune to be able to even deal in, and you're subsidizing hundreds of thousands of dollars of interest payments on an annual basis for a long-term contract, uh, and that's not what we need to be thinking about.
I think that the current law says you can invest in Alaska if it's going to produce a similar return to some investment outside. So it's something like that. Um, the question is how you put the specifics into that. It's difficult, and I might say that the investment professionals have said that one of the problems with the 200 million that was invested in the state is that they had trouble coming up with worthy investments. And I
So
know Craig disagrees with me on this, but
no, I actually it's some things I do and some things I don't, and I'm happy to give both the good and the bad of that,
yeah.
and very quickly. So Dermot's right. This permanent funds investment mandate provides that the permanent fund shall invest in state if there is a like return with a like risk. That's a huge part of it, right? It's not just the returns; the risk has to be the same as what you can get out of state. My observations was that the permanent fund ended up selecting two in-state managers. One did pretty well, and by that I mean they did very well, and one of them did not do very well. And it's like anything. If you have a well-designed program and it's executed well and it's executed without politics and it's executed as good fiduciaries, I think in-state investment done properly does a lot of good for the state, whether it's through ADA or whether through its permanent fund. If it is not done well, it does not do good for the state. So it's like all things in investing. If you do a very good job with what you're doing, you add a lot of value, and if you don't, you don't. And that's it. You got to have fiduciaries that are in the role that can do a good job. I think that comes around to the governance.
Um, yeah, And speaking of the governance and and related to some points we made earlier, um, I guess I'll just start with an anecdote. I held a practice session on my slides over the weekend, and one of the most politically sophisticated people in Alaska, someone who's paid to understand campaigns very well, is actually a professional a campaign professional. Um, asked me, and what's the difference between the permanent fund and the constitutional budget reserve? Or I mean, that was one of the questions after watching, that's why I talked about the constitutional budget reserve in my slides, and wanted to know the difference between the POMV draw and spending money from the constitutional budget reserve. And that gets to a larger point that it's come up from the audience and in this discussion before. How do we get the public to given how important the permanent fund is to Alaska, and how even more important it will become over time, even more so than today. How do we get the people of Alaska to understand better how it works, what's happening, and just know that better? And I'm open to answers from any one of you
You
three
know,
thought about it.
Cliff, let me chime in here. I think the Permanent Fund Corporation has compiled a lot of good materials over the years. And if people read that material and understood it, we'd be in a much better position. But it's not getting read and it's not getting understood. Um, so I really believe the legislature has to look at this. The executive branch should look at it as well and recognize the problem. Right? We haven't seen any recognition of this problem outside of the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation. So,
Craig, you served on the board of trustees for approximately 10 years. What thoughts do you have about this question?
Well, I think it's incredibly difficult, and we talked about this in our practice run that I've read that the Alaska population turns over on average every 7 years, which means it's really hard to have a broadly informed electorate that changes so much. Even the legislature, look how often they turn over. It's equally as difficult when you work on issues like the gas line or the permanent fund. Got subsets of legislators that stay there a long time. They have staffers there a long time, but a lot of those turn over too. So we just must accept the fact that there has to be a constant and continuous education effort. And I think the permanent fund does pretty well, but it's not in the business of education. So it's never gonna be perfect, right? It's never gonna be all you need.
yeah, but
So
it
I
should
don't,
be, Craig, it should be in the business of education. That's part of help making this thing survive. You know, I think.
yeah. Yeah, no, maybe I use my words poorly. I mean, they do spend a lot of time on this and a fair amount of money. It's just a really tough challenge because what people care about is people care about their dividend. They don't call it the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation. They call it the Alaska Dividend Corporation or the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend. Um, and I mean, I would say like, I don't know, 1 in 10, 1 in 5, whatever the number is, can actually differentiate between what the permanent fund does and the setting of the dividend. And it's probably been that way since statehood. I mean, not since statehood, since the creation of the fund.
Yeah.
I
Well, we
don't think
certainly.
it's, oh,
Rick, go ahead.
We're not
Rick,
helped by the quality of our candidates. Our candidates for elected office bear a lot of the responsibility and advertising. And in their advertising because they think dividend ads work, so they keep recycling the same stuff all the time.
Let's talk to the most experienced candidate in this panel. Rick Halford, do you have thoughts on this question of how we can get the public to understand the permanent fund better?
well, of course, the obscure what is it? The CIA fact book of 25 years ago said the Alaska Permanent Fund was the fund that its beneficiaries knew the most about of any fund that they had found in the world. And they said it was because of the dividend. That was an odd, I don't know where I came across that, but the connection did get people interested. And it got people, in some people's opinion, too interested, and it became, the permanent dividend fund instead of the permanent fund dividend. But some kind of balance in that equation comes back to the answer because education is incredibly important, and transparency is incredibly important. And if transparency costs us some players in private equity, then the price is worth it because trust is what you got to have, that, and it's a balance of what the attitude of the public is versus the maximum rate of return. But if you don't have the public, you don't have the fund.
Okay.
Can I just add one anecdote? I remember
Sure.
just again years ago, Dave Rose telling me when I was a young attorney, he said, he always believed that the dividend was great because it created a constituency. It was sort of like a dividend on a stock, or he even called it, if I recall correctly, a bribe to keep the people interested in the money not getting spent. But he said, but we could have had that for $300 and now we're paying 2,000.
Hey,
Uh,
Cliff, let me just, I want to chime in here for one thing. It looks like there was a comment from Fran Ulmer about one point of clarification. Purpose of the amendment 1976 was not only to keep the legislature from spending too much, it was also to provide a stream of revenue in the future when oil revenues diminished or disappeared. In the mid 70s, the Prudhoe Bay field was considered a limited life field that might last 25 years. I remember that. There was a lot of talk that would end at the year 2000. Other fields were discovered, better technology, so it expanded. I worked for Jay Hammond at the time and went around Alaska talking to groups about why it was important to vote for the amendment. There was no talk of a dividend in 1976. Well, there was a talk of the dividend in 1976 by Jay Hammond, and some legislators, Hugh Malone, and others also kind of favored that idea of some in different ways. But some thought the dividend might be a low interest loan. So you get a dividend, but it didn't really take the shape that it became that we know today until the early 80s. But anyway,
um,
that is true. It is true. I voted for the permanent fund. I remember voting for this, and the idea was, yes, when the oil runs out, there'll be something to run the state. So
I would also note, and I researched this a lot for uh, uh, some chapters of books that I co-authored with the chapters with Greg Erickson, who I think is on one of the people on this audience. And I lived through it, but I went back and researched the creation of the permanent fund as well later, years later. Everything from dams to daycare centers, as well as dividends, were dangled in front of the people of Alaska to get them to vote for the permanent fund. I understand that the dividend was not a major thing pushed at the time before the 1976 vote, but it was mentioned, as you point out, Dermot. But also dams, loans, help for industries, as well as I said, daycare centers. The one thing you can say for sure was save some for the future. And
Mhm.
then what you do, for it afterwards, uh, you know, uh, what you're saving for was not quite as clear to people or agreed
Hey,
upon.
let me just toss in one other thing here. I see there's also a note from Terry Gardner, who is one of the few surviving people from the 1976 legislature that voted for the permanent fund amendment. It says nationally, we have learned that many aspects of governments are norms and not actually required by law. For example, Alaska has been lucky that no governor has used his appointment powers and two commissioners to steer the permanent fund in the wrong direction. Transparency, more legislative oversight, and other options should be examined to strengthen the norms. I think that's really a good point.
Yeah.
One thing
Um,
about what the intentions were, I mean, Elmer traveled around with legislators for several years, and his conclusion, as written in the Permanent Fund Papers, is there was no consensus other than saving the money. There were all the elements we've discussed were talked about individually, but nothing was discouraged, and it was basically a part of the the sales of the permanent fund to save the money to let all of those things be part of the equation. But there was no consensus either for or against the dividend, for or against endowing the bureaucracy, for or against endowing loan funds. But there were lots of people that believed their reason for voting was one of those things.
But really, Rick, the dividend discussion in the public did not really happen until after the amendment was in the Constitution. There was no real discussion of a dividend in advance of the amendment to the Constitution. And
um, I,
it just there wasn't. I mean, Hammond had this idea in his head, but there just wasn't a broad discussion.
there were a few stray references in the public record before the 1976 vote, but it was never a major
Yeah.
theme of the debate. What I want to say is we have only a couple minutes left. I'd like each of you panelists to give your best 30 seconds. And I'm going to go in reverse order now. Dermot, what's your best 30 seconds to end this? And then I'm going to go to Craig and then Rick.
Um, if the legislature gets more involved in this and actually creates a standing committee, maybe a joint special committee that deals with the fund, I think that would be a great advance. Um, and that could also be a start to try to deal with the dividend.
Craig.
I'll say I don't think I see quite as much need for big governance reforms, maybe some others do. But I will say if folks are going to do it, when you're dealing with trusts, when you're dealing with pension plans, when you're dealing with something like the permanent fund, the responsibility really comes through the fiduciary standards of those responsible for managing the funds. So that's where you focus, I think, your governance reform. You're never going to reform legislature being too into politics and a governor having too much power. But I think you could solve a lot of problems by having very clear articulated fiduciary obligations for trustees and the staff. And that's true for the ARM board too.
Rick, best 30.
As long as we can keep continuing the money we take out of the permanent fund to fund the government that we're unwilling to pay for and are not willing to get a fair return for our resources, the permanent fund is going to continue to go down. The permanent fund is a trust for our conversion of non-renewable resources that should belong to all generations of Alaskans, and we're not passing enough forward if we continue to increase our spending to avoid taxation or reasonable resource return.
Thank you. And before I turn it over to Alex for the very end, we did not get to all the questions that were asked. I particularly want to reach out to anonymous attendee and to David Leslie. I'm going to give my email address. You can write me and I'll respond, including about the best books and articles to learn more about the Permanent Fund. cliff.grow@gmail.com. Cliff, Cliff, like falling off a cliff, .grow, GROH, @gmail.com, and I will answer questions that we did not get to today in this presentation. Thanks a lot to all of our panelists. I'm going to return and now turn this over to Alex Jorgensen. Thank you,
Thank you,
Alex.
Cliff.
Yeah, and again, a big thank you to all of you, Dermot, Craig, Rick, and Cliff, for a really interesting and informative discussion. I know I learned, I've been kind of following perennially the kind of these issues for a lot of years growing up and going to college here, but I think I definitely learned a lot tonight. So I'm glad we had all of you here. And a special thank you to all of you who took the time this evening to join us and learn more about the Alaska Permanent Fund and its governance structure. A big thank you to Alaska Common Ground's Fiscal Policy Working Group who put this event together. That group includes Chuck Gilbert, Cliff Grow, Rick Hafford, Jess Bronlick, and myself. And an additional thank you to Jess for setting up and running the Zoom and for all the things that she does to make the work of Alaska Common Ground happen. And again, Alaska Common Ground could not host these events without the support of our members. If you are not already an Alaska Common Ground member, we invite you to learn more about our organization and become a member or make a donation. Your support really fuels our work and advances us to have more of these types of discussions to create an engaged Alaska democracy. So again, thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you at a future event. So thanks everyone.